Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that should be impossible. Picture the Nile River, that eternal artery of civilization, flowing through Egypt for thousands of years with such reliable predictability that entire dynasties built their power on knowing exactly when it would flood. Now imagine waking up one morning to find it frozen solid. Ice. In Egypt, we're going to explore how a civilization that had mastered the rhythms of nature for millennia responded when those rhythms suddenly, catastrophically, stopped making sense. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious whether you're settling in for the night or listening during the day. If you've got personal experience with extreme weather events that defied all logic, or if you remember the winter of '78 or other brutal cold snaps that caught everyone off guard, I'd especially love to hear your stories down below. Your generation lived through history that younger folks only read about. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. For 3,000 years, give or take a few centuries, ancient Egypt ran like clockwork. Not the kind of clockwork we're familiar with. No gears, no springs, no precision manufacturing. But clockwork nonetheless, driven by the most reliable timekeeper nature had to offer, the Nile River. Every single year, without fail, the river would flood. The waters would rise starting in late summer, inundate the fields, deposit nutrient-rich silt, then recede. Plant, grow, harvest, repeat. For millennia, this wasn't just predictable. This was the foundation of an entire civilization's worldview. The Egyptians built their calendar around it, their economy depended on it, their religion incorporated it as divine order, and their entire agricultural system was designed with the absolute certainty that the river would do what the river had always done. They became, arguably, the most stable civilization the ancient world had ever seen, precisely because they could count on this one fundamental truth: the Nile would flood. If you think about it, and those of you who lived through the Great Depression or remember farming before industrial agriculture will understand this. The Egyptians had achieved something remarkable. They built a society where famine wasn't a constant threat, where food security was, if not guaranteed, at least highly probable. They knew what to expect, they planned for it, they thrived on it. But here's the thing about systems built on absolute certainty. They're remarkably fragile when that certainty disappears. We often think of ancient Egypt as this unchanging, eternal civilization, frozen in time with its pyramids and pharaohs. The popular image is one of hot desert sun, endless sand, the Nile flowing placidly through it all, unchanging and eternal. That image isn't entirely wrong, but it's incomplete. Because what we're about to explore is the hidden history of Egypt, the chapters that don't make it into the tour guides or the coffee table books, the times when the climate didn't cooperate, when the predictable became unpredictable, when the impossible happened. Now, before we go further, we need to address something important. When we talk about the Nile freezing, we're entering territory that sits at the intersection of documented history, archaeological evidence, and climate science. This isn't a simple story with clear-cut answers. What we're exploring tonight is how ancient civilizations coped with extreme climate anomalies that challenged everything they knew. We're examining historical and scientific evidence to understand moments when the reliable became unreliable, when the impossible became real. This is educational investigation, not sensationalism. We're approaching this the way your generation approaches most things, with healthy skepticism, attention to evidence, and respect for complexity. The historical record gives us tantalizing hints, obscure references in papyri, inscriptions that mention years of cold, archaeological evidence of disrupted harvests, climate data from ice cores and tree rings that suggest periods of dramatic cooling. We're going to piece this puzzle together, acknowledging what we know, what we don't know, and what we can reasonably infer. Because here's what we do know for certain: climate changes. Not on human timescales necessarily, but it changes. And when it does, civilizations adapt or they collapse. Ancient Egypt, for all its stability, wasn't immune to these forces. They faced droughts. They faced unusually low floods. They faced years when the inundation failed entirely. And if the climate science is correct, if those ice cores and tree rings are telling us the truth, there were periods of such extreme cold that even Egypt, land of endless sun and heat, experienced winter in ways that would have seemed apocalyptic to a people who barely had a word for snow. Let's start with what the ancient Egyptians themselves left us. The historical record, fragmented as it is, contains references that don't quite fit the standard narrative. Inscriptions that mention years of cold, papyri that describe failed harvests, not from lack of flood, but from something else. Something the scribes struggled to explain because they lacked the vocabulary for phenomena they'd never experienced. One particularly intriguing text, from what scholars believe is the Middle Kingdom period, that's roughly 2000 to 1700 BC, for those keeping score, describes a year when the river refused to rise and the cold descended like a foreign invasion. The scribe who recorded this clearly found it worthy of note, unusual enough to preserve in permanent record. This wasn't just a bad flood year, this was something different, something wrong. Another text, even more fragmented, mentions ice forming on the pools of the gardens during what should have been the warm season. Now, to put this in perspective, normal winter temperatures in ancient Egypt, even during cold snaps, would have been what we consider mild. 50s, maybe low 40s, Fahrenheit at the coldest in the north. Nothing that would freeze standing water. For ice to form, you're talking about temperatures well below freezing, sustained long enough for water to crystallize. In Egypt, along the Nile, the scribes, bless them, did their best to record what they were seeing, but they were working with a language and a conceptual framework that had no real vocabulary for extreme cold. It would be like trying to describe a smartphone to someone from the 19th century. You can use the words you have, but they're inadequate to the reality you're trying to capture. Those of you who served in Korea will remember trying to explain to folks back home what that kind of cold felt like. The words didn't quite work, did they? Cold doesn't begin to cover it. You'd say cold, and people would think, oh, like a winter day, but you meant something else entirely. Something that changed how you thought, how you moved, how you survived. The Egyptian scribes faced a similar communication problem. But they tried, and what they left us, scattered across temples and tombs and papyri, are clues, pieces of a puzzle that, when combined with modern climate science, start to paint a picture of periods when Egypt's climate went haywire in ways that challenge the very foundation of their civilization. Historians debate these texts intensely. Some argue the references are metaphorical, poetic exaggerations meant to emphasize divine displeasure or royal propaganda. Others suggest they're recording real events, but lacking the scientific framework to describe them accurately. And still others believe they're straightforward accounts of genuine climate anomalies that we're only now beginning to understand through paleoclimate research. What makes these accounts particularly interesting is their specificity. These aren't vague references to hard times or difficult years. They mention specific details, the timing within the Egyptian calendar, the duration of the cold, the effects on agriculture and livestock. One text describes livestock dying, not from hunger, but from the biting air. Another mentions the sacred lake freezing such that priests could walk upon its surface to reach the inner sanctuary. A detail so specific and so bizarre that it's hard to dismiss as mere literary flourish. And here's where it gets really interesting. When we cross-reference these textual accounts with modern climate data, ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica, tree ring data from around the Mediterranean, sediment cores from the Nile Delta itself, we start to see correlations. Periods when the Egyptian texts mention extreme cold correspond, in some cases, to periods when climate scientists have identified global or regional cooling events. Now we need to talk about ice cores, tree rings, and sediment analysis. Bear with me here. This might sound dry, no pun intended, but this is how we bridge the gap between ancient texts that hint at the impossible and modern scientific understanding of what actually happened. Ice cores are essentially frozen time capsules. When snow falls in places like Greenland or Antarctica, it compresses over time into ice, trapping air bubbles and atmospheric particles from that specific moment in history. Scientists can drill down through these ice sheets, extracting cores that go back hundreds of thousands of years. Then they analyze those trapped air bubbles, measuring isotope ratios that tell us about temperature, atmospheric composition, even volcanic activity. What they've found, among many other things, are periods of dramatic, rapid cooling throughout human history. We're not talking about gradual climate shifts over millennia. We're talking about temperature drops of 10, 15, sometimes 20 degrees Fahrenheit or more occurring over just a few years or decades. Events that would have had catastrophic effects on civilizations that had adapted to specific climate conditions. Tree rings tell a similar story. Every year, a tree adds a growth ring. Wide rings mean good growing conditions, plenty of warmth, adequate moisture. Narrow rings mean stress, drought, cold, or both. By examining ancient trees and wood samples from archaeological sites, scientists can reconstruct climate conditions year by year, sometimes even season by season, going back thousands of years. When scientists analyze tree rings from the eastern Mediterranean region, including samples from Egypt itself, where wood preservation is possible in the dry climate, they found evidence of what they call frost rings. These are damage patterns in the wood caused by sudden, severe freezing that literally bursts the tree cells. Frost rings in Egyptian timbers. Let that sink in for a moment. And then there's the sediment data from the Nile itself. When scientists core down through the sediment layers in the delta, they can analyze pollen, mineral composition, and organic material to reconstruct not just what the climate was like, but how the river itself behaved. They've identified periods when the normal flood cycles were disrupted, years when almost no sediment was deposited, suggesting weak or failed floods. And more surprisingly, layers that show evidence of freeze-thaw cycles in the sediment itself. Put it all together: the ancient texts, the ice cores, the tree rings, the sediment data. And you get a picture of multiple periods scattered across Egypt's 3,000-year history when the climate did things it absolutely shouldn't have done according to our modern understanding of Egyptian weather patterns. The most likely candidate for an extreme cold event, the kind that might have actually frozen portions of the Nile, appears to have occurred during what scientists call the 4.2 kiloyear event, roughly 2200 BC. This was a period of rapid climate change that affected civilizations across the Middle East and Mediterranean. Sumerian texts describe it as a time of chaos. The Akkadian Empire collapsed, and Egyptian records from this period, while fragmentary, describe social upheaval, famine, and yes, unusual cold. Another period of interest is during the Late Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BC, when multiple civilizations across the Mediterranean region simultaneously fell apart. Climate data suggests this was a period of drought and temperature extremes, both hotter summers and, crucially, colder winters than the region had experienced in centuries. Those of you who remember the winter of 62-63 in Europe, or the brutal cold snap of 78 in the States, understand how rare weather events can catch entire societies off guard. Modern civilization, with all our heating systems and infrastructure and global supply chains, can handle these anomalies. Ancient civilizations? Not so much. So let's tackle the central question. Could the Nile actually have frozen? Not just frost on the edges, not just ice in shallow pools, but serious, substantial freezing of the river itself. From a purely physical standpoint, freezing requires sustained temperatures below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, obviously. The Nile, flowing from equatorial Africa, brings relatively warm water north. Even in winter, the water temperature in the Nile rarely drops below 60 degrees Fahrenheit in Upper Egypt, maybe 55 in the Delta region near the Mediterranean. For ice to form on a moving river, you need not just cold air temperatures, but sustained cold. Days and nights well below freezing. The kind of cold that overwhelms the water's thermal mass and its movement. Rivers don't freeze easily. The current keeps water moving, and moving water resists freezing. You need what they call a hard freeze, extended periods of significantly sub-freezing temperatures. the kind that make veterans of northern winters nod knowingly, and younger folks shiver at the thought. But it's not impossible. If, and this is a big if, Egypt experienced a climate anomaly severe enough, a cold snap lasting weeks rather than days, with temperatures dropping into the teens or single digits Fahrenheit, the Nile could freeze, at least partially. Not the whole river probably, not the fastest flowing sections, but the slower stretches, the backwaters, the irrigation canals that depended on that water. Absolutely. Think about the Great Lakes in North America during severe winters. These are massive bodies of water, yet they can freeze substantially when conditions are right. The Nile, for all its majesty, is much smaller. If the atmospheric conditions aligned, a high-pressure system bringing Arctic or Siberian air masses south, persisting for weeks, combined with clear nights allowing maximum radiational cooling. The unthinkable becomes merely improbable. Climate scientists studying the 4.2 kiloyear event have documented that global temperatures dropped by several degrees during this period. That might not sound like much, but average temperature changes of just a degree or two can mean the difference between rain and drought, between mild winters and killing freezes. If Egypt, normally semi-arid and warm, suddenly experienced the kind of winter you'd expect in southern France or northern Italy, that would be catastrophic enough. If it experienced the kind of winter you'd expect in, say, Bulgaria or Romania, which contemporary climate data suggests might have been possible during peak anomaly years, you're talking about conditions that could absolutely freeze portions of the Nile. Historical precedent exists, albeit from much later periods. European travelers in the mid-19th century reported ice forming on the Nile during an unusual cold snap in 1864. Not a complete freeze, but enough ice formation that local Egyptians, who had never seen such a thing, reacted with amazement and fear. If it could happen in the relatively warm 1800s, it could certainly have happened during more extreme climate anomalies in antiquity. The real question isn't whether it could physically happen. Climate science says it could, under the right conditions. The real question is, what happened to the people who depended on that river when it betrayed every expectation they'd built their entire civilization around? Those of you who lived through the Depression understand what it means when the fundamental assumptions of an economy suddenly prove false, when the banks that were supposed to be safe failed, when jobs that were supposed to be secure vanished, when the systems everyone relied on simply stopped working. The psychological impact of that, the way it shakes your faith in everything you thought was solid, that's what we're talking about here. Except, instead of economic systems, it was the literal foundation of survival: water, agriculture, food. Let's talk about what a frozen Nile would actually mean for Egyptian agriculture, because this is where theory becomes visceral: human suffering. The Egyptian agricultural calendar was exquisitely tuned to the Nile's rhythm. The flood came in late summer, usually July through September by our calendar. As the waters receded in October, farmers planted their crops in the rich, moist silt left behind. Winter crops, wheat, barley, flax, grew during the cooler months, maturing in time for harvest in March and April, before the heat of summer made further agriculture impossible. This system worked beautifully as long as temperatures stayed within expected ranges. Winter in Egypt was the growing season, precisely because temperatures were mild enough for crops but cool enough to reduce water loss through evaporation. Perfect. Now introduce a hard freeze. Suddenly, those winter crops, already struggling if the flood had been poor, face temperatures they're simply not evolved to handle. Wheat can survive light frosts, a few degrees below freezing, for short periods. But prolonged freezing? Days or weeks of hard cold? The plants die. The cells burst from ice crystal formation. The metabolic process is shut down. The roots freeze in the ground. Dead. Total crop failure. But the freeze isn't even the worst part. The worst part is what happens to the irrigation system. Remember, Egyptian agriculture didn't just depend on the annual flood. Between floods, farmers relied on an elaborate network of canals, channels, and water-lifting devices to keep their fields watered. This system required liquid water, water you could redirect, lift, channel, control. freeze that water, and the entire system stops functioning. Imagine trying to irrigate a field with ice. Can't be done. The shadufs, those counterweighted poles with buckets that Egyptian farmers used to lift water from canals to fields, become useless decorations when the canals are frozen. The careful engineering of sluice gates and water flow management becomes irrelevant when water stops flowing. Veterans of Korea will remember what cold does to equipment and infrastructure. Weapons freeze, engines won't start. Systems designed for temperate climates simply fail when the temperature drops far enough. The Egyptian irrigation system, designed for a climate where freezing was literally inconceivable, would have been just as vulnerable. And here's the cascading failure. Even after the cold snap passes, even when temperatures return to normal, the damage is done. The crops are dead. The planting season has passed. There's no way to make up for lost time. You have to wait for the next cycle, the next flood, the next planting season. That means months, potentially a full year of food shortage, of famine. The Egyptian diet was heavily grain-based. Bread and beer, both made from wheat and barley, constituted the majority of calories for most people. There were other foods, certainly. Fish from the Nile, vegetables, some meat for those who could afford it. But grain was the foundation. Grain was what kept the civilization fed. Lose the grain harvest, and you're looking at widespread hunger within months. The wealthy and powerful would weather it. They had storage, reserves, the ability to import food from elsewhere if necessary. But the average farmer, the laborer, the craftsman, they lived much closer to the edge. A bad harvest meant hardship. A completely failed harvest meant starvation. Historical records from known famine periods in Egypt describe conditions that would be familiar to anyone who lived through the Dust Bowl or heard their grandparents' stories from the Depression. People eating anything they could find, plants that wouldn't normally be considered food, animals that would normally be kept for labor or breeding, trading valuables for scraps of food, children with distended bellies and vacant eyes. The texts from the first intermediate period, which followed the Old Kingdom's collapse, possibly triggered or worsened by the 4.2 kiloyear climate event we mentioned earlier, describe people so desperate they allegedly ate their own dead. Whether that's literally true or propaganda exaggeration, the fact that scribes felt compelled to record such horrors tells us something about the severity of the crisis. And here's something modern folks don't always grasp. In a subsistence agricultural economy, there's no safety net, no FEMA, no disaster relief, no grocery stores stocked with food from other regions. You eat what you grow or what you can trade for. When the crops fail, people die. It's that simple and that brutal. Those of you who remember wartime rationing understand scarcity. You understand what it means to make do with less, to carefully budget resources, to go without. But even wartime rationing assumed there was food somewhere, being distributed according to need and fairness. In an ancient famine caused by climate catastrophe, there was no food anywhere. The problem wasn't distribution. The problem was absolute scarcity. Now, let's talk about what happens to political power when the fundamental assumption of agricultural prosperity suddenly evaporates. Because this is where climate catastrophe becomes political crisis. The pharaoh's legitimacy rested on a divine mandate, yes, but it also rested on something more practical, his ability to maintain ma'at, the Egyptian concept of order, justice, and cosmic balance. As long as the Nile flooded predictably, as long as harvests were good, as long as Egypt prospered, the pharaoh's claim to divine favor seemed self-evident. But what happens when the Nile freezes, when crops fail, when people starve? Suddenly, that divine mandate starts looking questionable. If the pharaoh is supposedly the link between gods and men, the guarantor of Egypt's prosperity, and yet Egypt is suffering unprecedented climate catastrophe, well, either the pharaoh has lost the god's favor, or he was never truly divine to begin with. This isn't theoretical speculation. We have historical evidence of exactly this kind of political crisis. The collapse of the Old Kingdom, following the construction of the Great Pyramids, coincides with climate data showing severe drought and possible cold anomalies. The first intermediate period that followed was characterized by political fragmentation, rival dynasties, and what the Egyptians themselves described as chaos and disorder. One text from this period, known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer, describes a world turned upside down. The rich have become poor, the poor presumed to wealth, foreign invaders enter Egypt unopposed, and, significantly, the river is blood and grain has perished everywhere. Whether this is eyewitness account or literary exaggeration, it reflects a society in crisis, where the normal order has broken down. When people are starving, they don't tend to remain politically passive. History shows us this over and over again. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, countless other upheavals. They often have food scarcity and climate stress as contributing factors, if not primary causes. Egypt would have been no different. When the crops fail and the granaries empty, people demand action. If the pharaoh can't provide it, can't make the Nile flow, can't make the cold retreat, can't conjure grain from nowhere, his authority weakens. Regional governors and nobles, who control their own grain stores and local resources, suddenly become more powerful than the central government. In good times, they owed loyalty to Pharaoh and the unified state. In famine times, they look after their own territories first. This is how empires fragment. This is how unified states break into rival kingdoms. The Old Kingdom's collapse followed exactly this pattern. Strong central authority giving way to regional power bases, each nome, Egyptian province, essentially becoming its own small kingdom under its governor. Those who remember the Depression or heard stories from parents who lived through it understand how economic crisis can reshape politics, how it can make people lose faith in existing institutions, how it can make radical change seem not just possible, but necessary. Now amplify that by an order of magnitude, because instead of an economic depression where there's still food available somewhere, we're talking about literal starvation with no relief in sight. The texts from this period describe nomarchs, regional governors, essentially doing whatever they wanted, ignoring or defying royal edicts, building their own monuments, maintaining their own armies. The pharaoh, in theory the absolute ruler of all Egypt, became in practice just one more regional power player, and often not even the strongest one. And here's where it gets interesting from a historical perspective. These periods of fragmentation, these intermediate periods, were often relatively brief. A few decades, maybe a century at most. Then Egypt would reunify under a new dynasty, a new pharaoh who could restore order, re-establish central authority, and bring back the prosperity that Egypt's geography and climate, when behaving normally, naturally provided. This suggests resilience, yes, but also something else. These climate crises, severe as they were temporary. The Nile would freeze, crops would fail, the kingdom would fragment, but then conditions would improve. The climate would return to its normal patterns. The Nile would flood reliably again, and Egypt, with its fundamental geographic advantages intact, could rebuild. Those of you who lived through multiple recessions, maybe the 70s oil crisis or earlier economic troubles, understand this pattern. Crisis hits, institutions strain or break, there's a period of chaos and reorganization, then recovery when underlying conditions improve. Egypt went through this cycle multiple times over its long history, and each time it came back. But that resilience came at tremendous human cost. The people who starved during the famine, who died in the political upheavals, who suffered through the intermediate periods, they didn't get to enjoy the eventual recovery. History may show Egypt's resilience over centuries, but individual Egyptians experienced catastrophe, pure and simple. Now we need to talk about how a deeply religious civilization processed a climate catastrophe that challenged everything they believed about cosmic order and divine will. For the Egyptians, there was no clear distinction between natural and supernatural, between physical and spiritual. The Nile's flood wasn't just a predictable meteorological event. It was the work of Hapi, god of the inundation. The seasons weren't just climate patterns, but the eternal cycle of Re, the sun god, traveling through his daily journey across the sky and nightly voyage through the underworld. Everything had divine significance. So when the Nile froze, when the impossible happened, when nature violated its own established patterns, the religious implications were staggering. This wasn't just a weather anomaly. This was cosmic disorder. This was Ma'at, the fundamental order of the universe, breaking down. The priests, whose entire role was to maintain proper relations between Egypt and the gods through ritual, offerings, and prayer, would have been under enormous pressure. Why had the gods allowed this? What had Egypt done to deserve such punishment? How could the proper order be restored? We can see evidence of their responses in the archaeological record. Periods of crisis show increased ritual activity, more offerings, more prayers, more elaborate ceremonies. Not because things were going well and they wanted to celebrate, but because things were going terribly and they were desperately trying to fix whatever had gone wrong in the divine relationship. There's something deeply human about this response, something that transcends time and culture. When things go wrong, when we face crisis we can't understand or control, we turn to whatever belief system gives our lives meaning and beg for help. For the Egyptians, that meant intensified ritual, more offerings, greater attention to religious obligations. But here's the thing, offerings require resources, and during a famine, resources are exactly what you don't have. The texts describe people offering what they could. A handful of grain, a small fish, whatever they could spare from their own meager supplies. The priests continued their rituals, but they must have known, on some level, that burning incense and reciting prayers wouldn't make ice melt faster or dead crops grow back. Yet they did it anyway. Because what else could they do? This was their framework for understanding the world. If the gods controlled natural phenomena, then the solution to natural disaster had to be religious. Appeal to the gods. Correct whatever offense had caused their displeasure. Perform the right rituals with sufficient devotion, and order would be restored. Those who've lived through wars will recognize this mindset. When you're facing something beyond your control, something terrifying and potentially deadly, you turn to whatever faith you have. Foxhole prayers, they call it. Not because your certain prayer will work, but because it's the only tool you have available. The pharaoh's position was particularly precarious. He wasn't just the political leader. He was also the chief priest, the primary intermediary between Egypt and the gods. If the gods were punishing Egypt, it reflected on him personally. His legitimacy, his claim to divine kingship, rested on his ability to maintain cosmic order and secure divine favor. Some pharaohs responded by increasing their building programs, more temples, more monuments, more public works projects, to demonstrate their piety and curry divine favor. Others focused on ritual reform, trying to identify and correct whatever religious errors might have caused the crisis. Still others apparently doubled down on their divine claims, insisting more loudly than ever that they were gods incarnate, perhaps hoping that if they said it with sufficient conviction, the people would believe it despite evidence to the contrary. The problem, of course, was that none of this could address the actual cause of the crisis. The climate wasn't changing because the Egyptians had offended the gods. It was changing because of factors, volcanic eruptions, solar cycles, atmospheric circulation patterns that had nothing to do with human behavior, ritual purity, or divine favor. But the Egyptians didn't know that. They couldn't know that. They were working with the conceptual framework they had, trying to solve a physical problem with religious tools because those were the only tools their worldview provided. And yet, and this is important, the religious response wasn't entirely useless. It served psychological and social functions, even if it didn't control the weather. It gave people something to do, some sense of agency in the face of overwhelming crisis. It created communal solidarity, bringing people together in shared ritual and shared suffering. It provided a narrative framework for making sense of chaos, even if that framework wasn't scientifically accurate. Those who've been through collective trauma, wartime, disasters, economic collapse, understand the importance of these social and psychological coping mechanisms. The specific content of the belief system matters less than its function, providing meaning, creating community, offering hope that things might improve if only you perform the right actions with sufficient dedication. The Egyptians performed those actions. They prayed, they sacrificed, They maintained their rituals even when it cost them precious resources they could barely spare. And eventually, whether because of those prayers or simply because climate anomalies don't last forever, conditions did improve. The Nile flowed again, temperatures normalized, the crops grew, and when they did, the priests could point to their rituals and say, "See? Our prayers worked, the gods heard us, order has been restored." And the people, desperate for any reassurance that their world made sense again, would believe it. Because the alternative, that they lived at the mercy of random climate fluctuations beyond anyone's control, was too terrifying to accept. Now, let's get practical. Let's talk about what the Egyptians actually did on the ground to survive climate catastrophes when they hit. Because for all the religious ritual and political upheaval, survival ultimately came down to very practical questions of food storage, resource management, and adaptation. Storage was, and always has been, the primary defense against famine. You can't control whether this year's harvest succeeds or fails, but if you've stored enough from previous good years, you can survive the bad ones. The Egyptians understood this intimately. Evidence suggests they maintained granaries at multiple scales: local village storage, regional administrative granaries, and massive royal storehouses. The pharaoh's grain reserves served multiple purposes. They provided food for government workers and officials, supported public works projects, and crucially, acted as famine relief when harvests failed. The famous biblical story of Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dream. 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, with Joseph advising the storage of surplus grain during good years to survive the bad. This reflects real Egyptian administrative practice. Whether or not Joseph existed as a historical figure, the storage strategy described was absolutely standard Egyptian policy. During good years, taxation often took the form of grain. Farmers would pay a portion of their harvest to the state, which would store it in those massive granaries. In theory, this grain could be distributed during times of shortage. In practice, well, storage is one thing, fair distribution is another. Those with power and connections got first access. Those without either starved or sold themselves into servitude in exchange for food. Those who remember the wartime rationing system or heard about the food lines during the Depression understand how critical distribution systems become during scarcity. Having food in storage doesn't help if you can't get it to the people who need it. The Egyptians faced this challenge without modern transportation, refrigeration, or communication networks. Moving grain from granaries to starving populations required boats, donkeys, and manpower. It required administrators to assess needs, prioritize distribution, and prevent hoarding or corruption. It required guards to protect grain shipments from desperate people who might otherwise seize them by force. The logistics were formidable even under the best circumstances. During climate crisis, when infrastructure might be damaged and political authority weakened, the challenges multiplied. But storage alone wasn't sufficient. Smart Egyptians also practiced diversification, not putting all their metaphorical eggs in one basket. While wheat and barley were the staples, they also cultivated vegetables, raised livestock, fished the Nile, and in some regions, practiced date cultivation. This diversification provided some insurance. If grain crops failed due to cold, perhaps fish would still be available. If fields froze, perhaps date palms, being trees with deeper roots and greater cold tolerance, might survive better than annual crops. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it provided some resilience against catastrophic failure of any single food source. The wealthy and well-connected could take this further. They might maintain estates in different regions of Egypt, spreading geographic risk. If one area experienced worse climate conditions, perhaps another would fare better. They could afford to import food from outside Egypt if necessary. Essentially, they could diversify their way to survival. The poor had fewer options. A small farmer with one plot of land, no reserves, and no way to import food from elsewhere was entirely vulnerable. When his crops failed, he and his family went hungry. If the crisis persisted, he might be forced to sell his land, his tools, even his freedom, to survive. This is where famine becomes not just a natural disaster, but a social and economic transformation. Climate catastrophe creates opportunity for those with capital to acquire land and resources from desperate sellers. Wealth concentrates, social stratification increases. The poor become poorer, the powerful more powerful. Those who lived through the Depression or its aftermath understand this dynamic. How foreclosures and forced sales during economic crisis allowed those with capital to acquire assets cheaply. How crisis accelerates wealth inequality. The mechanisms are different, but the pattern is ancient and depressingly consistent across time and place. Let's talk engineering, because the Egyptians weren't passive victims of climate. They were sophisticated engineers who modified their environment to maximize their chances of survival and prosperity. The basic Egyptian irrigation system relied on gravity flow. During the annual flood, water from the Nile would flow into canals and basins, then be distributed across fields through an intricate network of smaller channels. But this passive system had limitations. It depended on the flood reaching sufficient height. It couldn't easily access land above the natural flood level, and it couldn't respond to changing conditions with any flexibility. So the Egyptians developed active water management technology. The shadif, that counterweighted pole with a bucket, allowed farmers to lift water from canals to fields that wouldn't otherwise flood. Simple technology, very effective. One man operating a shaduf could irrigate a small plot that would otherwise be desert. Later innovations included the sakia, a water wheel turned by oxen or other draft animals, which could lift water more efficiently and in greater quantities than a manual shaduf. These devices extended the amount of land that could be cultivated and provided some insurance against weak floods. During the New Kingdom period, particularly under innovative pharaohs, there's archaeological evidence of more ambitious projects. Catchment basins designed to store floodwater for use throughout the dry season. Sophisticated canal systems that could be opened or closed with sluice gates to control water distribution. Engineering that treated water as a resource to be actively managed rather than passively received. Those who've worked with farming equipment or any kind of mechanical systems will appreciate the ingenuity here. These weren't simple devices. They required understanding of leverage, mechanical advantage, gear ratios, and materials engineering. The Egyptians didn't have detailed mathematical formulas for calculating these things, but they had practical knowledge refined over generations. They knew what worked. When climate anomalies threatened normal water supplies, this engineering capability became survival critical. Can't rely on the flood? Build better storage. Need to access higher ground for cultivation. Develop lifting mechanisms. Water freezing in canals? Well, that's trickier, but once it melts, make sure you've captured and stored every possible drop. There's evidence that periods of climate stress spurred innovation rather than just collapse. Facing crisis, Egyptian engineers developed new techniques, experimented with different approaches, found ways to wring productivity from land that previous generations would have written off as uncultivable. This isn't to minimize the suffering or deaths that occurred. Innovation doesn't prevent tragedy, but it does show human resilience and creativity in the face of overwhelming challenge. When the old methods don't work, you develop new methods or you die. The Egyptians developed new methods. One particularly interesting innovation appears during the First Intermediate Period, that time of political fragmentation and climate stress we discussed earlier. Archaeological evidence shows increased use of what historians call basin irrigation in Middle Egypt. This technique involved creating enclosed basins surrounded by earthen embankments. During the flood, water would be diverted into these basins and held there for weeks, allowing maximum sediment deposition and soil saturation. Then it would be drained in controlled fashion to prevent waterlogging. This required more labor and more sophisticated engineering than simple flow-through irrigation, but it made better use of whatever floodwater was available. It was an adaptation born of necessity. When you can't count on abundant water, you make the most of every drop you get. Similar adaptations appeared elsewhere. Deeper wells to access groundwater when surface water was scarce, improved channel lining to reduce seepage loss, better maintenance protocols to ensure infrastructure worked at maximum efficiency. Small improvements that added up to enhanced resilience. Those who served in the military will recognize this pattern. When resources are scarce, You don't waste anything. You maintain your equipment meticulously. You develop workarounds and field expedients. You find ways to accomplish the mission with whatever you've got available. The Egyptians applied the same principle to water management, and it wasn't just physical infrastructure. The administrative infrastructure also evolved. More careful record keeping of water levels and flood timing, better communication between regions to share information about conditions, stronger enforcement of water rights and usage regulations to prevent disputes and ensure equitable distribution. Water law became more sophisticated. Records from the Middle Kingdom show detailed regulations about canal maintenance obligations, water allocation during shortages, and penalties for those who diverted more than their share. When water became scarce, these regulations became critically important for preventing conflict. The thing about infrastructure investment is that it requires resources and stability. You can't build ambitious irrigation systems when you're starving or fighting a civil war. So there's a chicken and egg problem. You need infrastructure to weather climate stress, but you need stability to build infrastructure, and climate stress destroys stability. Egypt solved this problem through cycles. After crisis came recovery. During recovery, strong rulers would invest in infrastructure and administration. That infrastructure would help Egypt survive the next crisis somewhat better. Then another recovery, more investment, enhanced resilience. Over centuries, Egyptian engineering capability and administrative sophistication increased incrementally, each cycle adding layers of resilience that helped soften the blow of the next disaster. It wasn't a smooth progression. There were setbacks, periods of collapse, knowledge lost and needing to be relearned. But the overall trend, viewed across centuries, was toward greater engineering capability and more sophisticated management of a fundamentally challenging environment. This is the long view of civilization building that's easy to miss when focusing on individual crises. Yes, the frozen Nile would have been catastrophic for the generation experiencing it, but their suffering and the innovations born from it contributed to knowledge and infrastructure that helped future generations cope better with environmental challenges. Those who've watched communities recover from disaster, whether natural disasters, war damage, or economic collapse, understand this process. Each generation builds on what came before, learns from past mistakes, invests in resilience for the future. It's slow, it's costly, and it doesn't prevent all suffering. But over time, it makes societies more robust, more capable of weathering the next storm. Egypt's engineering legacy speaks for itself. The irrigation systems they developed, refined over millennia, remained in use well into the modern era. The Aswan Low Dam, built in 1902, was in many ways just a technological upgrade to principles the ancient Egyptians had established thousands of years earlier. Control the Nile, store its water, distribute it according to need, maximize agricultural productivity from a challenging environment. Now let's zoom out and look at how Egypt built resilience into its social and economic structures over the very long term. Because surviving individual climate crises, however difficult, isn't the same as building a civilization that can persist through multiple such crises over millennia. Egypt's greatest advantage was geography. The Nile, despite occasional freezes or droughts, was fundamentally reliable compared to rain-fed agriculture elsewhere, where Mesopotamian farmers dealt with unpredictable rivers that might flood catastrophically or barely at all. Egyptian farmers mostly experienced regular, predictable inundations. Where Mediterranean farmers prayed for rain that might or might not come, Egyptians built irrigation systems fed by a reliable river. This geographic advantage meant Egypt could support a larger population, generate greater agricultural surplus, and develop more sophisticated civilization than its neighbors could manage in their more challenging environments. Egypt's baseline was higher. So even when crisis hit and conditions deteriorated, Egypt was falling from a higher starting point and often remained better off than other regions, even in distress. Think of it as margin for error. If you're operating right at the edge of survival in good times, any bad year means catastrophe. If you're operating with surplus in good times, you can weather several bad years before reaching catastrophe. Egypt had more margin than most ancient civilizations. But the Egyptians didn't rely solely on this geographic luck. They intentionally built social and economic structures that enhanced resilience. The grain storage system we discussed earlier was one example. The professional bureaucracy was another. A literate, professional bureaucracy that maintained records, tracked resources, and coordinated complex activities across hundreds of miles and millions of people. This was rare in the ancient world and enormously valuable for crisis management. When famine hit, bureaucrats could assess the situation, calculate available reserves, organize distribution, coordinate relief efforts. None of this was possible in societies without such administrative infrastructure. The military also served as a resilience mechanism, and not just for defense. Egyptian soldiers were, as we discussed earlier, also laborers. They built roads and irrigation systems during peacetime. During crisis, they could be deployed for emergency infrastructure repair, grain transport, or maintenance of order. This multi-purpose force was expensive to maintain, but it provided capabilities that purely military or purely civilian organizations couldn't match. Religious institutions, too, played a role beyond the spiritual. Temples owned vast agricultural estates, maintained their own grain reserves, and operated effectively as economic corporations. During crisis, temple granaries sometimes provided relief when royal stores were exhausted or inaccessible. The downside was that temples used this economic power to gain political influence, sometimes at the expense of central royal authority. Those who remember how organizations like the Red Cross, military logistics, and government agencies coordinated during major disasters will recognize these patterns. Modern crisis management uses different tools and technologies, but the underlying principles: professional administration, resource tracking, coordinated response, multiple redundant institutions. These are ancient. Egypt also developed what we might call cultural resilience, shared identity, and values that persisted through political upheaval. Even when the kingdom fragmented during intermediate periods, Egyptians continued to see themselves as Egyptian, continued to use the same writing system, continued to worship the same gods, continued to aspire to reunification under legitimate pharaonic rule. This cultural continuity meant that recovery and reunification, when they came, could rebuild on familiar foundations rather than starting from scratch. Compare this to other regions where political collapse meant cultural fragmentation and the emergence of entirely new civilizations with different languages, religions, and identities. Egypt fractured politically but maintained cultural coherence, making reunification politically easier. The script was part of this. Hieroglyphic writing remained remarkably stable across millennia. A scribe from the Old Kingdom and a scribe from the Late Period, separated by 2,000 years, could theoretically read each other's writing. This wasn't purely accidental. It was actively maintained through scribal training that emphasized conservative preservation of traditional forms. Language change couldn't be entirely prevented. Spoken Egyptian evolved considerably over the centuries, but written Egyptian changed much more slowly, creating a literate culture with continuous access to its own history and traditions going back millennia. When Egyptians faced crisis, they could look to the past for precedent, for guidance, for evidence that Egypt had survived before and would survive again. This long historical memory was itself a form of resilience. Modern societies with short historical memories, a few generations at most, face each crisis as if it were unprecedented. Egyptian scribes could reference crises from 1,000 years earlier, study how they were handled, learn from successes and failures. This institutional knowledge made each crisis slightly more manageable than it would have been otherwise. Those of you who served will understand the value of institutional knowledge and tradition. Military units maintain histories, preserve lessons learned, pass down hard-won wisdom from generation to generation. This isn't nostalgia, it's survival. Egypt's scribal tradition served a similar function, creating institutional memory that spanned not decades or centuries but millennia. The final element of Egypt's resilience was sheer persistence and stubbornness. Egyptian civilization faced repeated challenges, climate crises, foreign invasions, internal upheavals, and each time it recovered. Each time it rebuilt. Each time it reconstituted itself along familiar lines: pharaonic kingship, bureaucratic administration, Nile-based agriculture, hieroglyphic literacy, traditional religion. Some civilizations, facing similar stress, transformed into something entirely different or collapsed entirely. Egypt bent, sometimes nearly to breaking, but it didn't fully break. It endured. This wasn't because Egyptians were inherently superior to other peoples. It was because geography gave them advantages, because they developed institutions and infrastructure that enhanced resilience, because they maintained cultural continuity that facilitated recovery. And yes, because sometimes they got lucky when circumstances could have gone either way. But resilience had costs. Each crisis, even when survived, killed people who might otherwise have lived. Each recovery required resources that might otherwise have gone to other purposes. Each cycle of collapse and rebuilding set back progress that might otherwise have accumulated. Egypt's persistence is admirable, but we shouldn't romanticize the suffering that persistence required. Now, we need to talk about what all of this means for us, because we're not studying ancient Egyptian climate crises purely for historical interest. We're living through our own climate transformation, and the past has lessons to offer. First, the obvious. Climate changes, sometimes rapidly, and when it does, civilizations experience severe stress. This isn't new. This isn't unprecedented. Human societies have faced climate catastrophes throughout history. Some survived, others didn't. The survivors were generally those who had built resilience, maintained flexibility, invested in infrastructure, and could coordinate collective action. Egypt survived multiple climate crises because of geographic advantages, yes, but also because of deliberate choices, maintaining grain reserves, investing in irrigation infrastructure, preserving institutional knowledge, keeping bureaucratic systems functional even during political fragmentation. These weren't accidents. They were policies that required resources and sustained commitment. Modern civilization faces climate change on a scale that dwarfs anything Egypt experienced. Global temperature changes, sea level rise, shifting precipitation patterns, more frequent extreme weather. Our crisis is bigger in scope, but it's not entirely different in kind. We face the same fundamental challenges. Can we adapt quickly enough? Can we maintain social cohesion during stress? Can we invest in resilience before crisis forces our hand? Egypt's grain storage and distribution system offers obvious parallels to modern food security challenges. We have vastly greater storage capacity and much better preservation technology. But we also have vastly greater population and more complex global supply chains. When crisis hits, whether pandemic, war, or climate disaster, our systems strain. We see panic buying, hoarding, distribution failures. The underlying dynamics aren't that different from ancient times. We're just operating at different scale. Egypt's investment in water infrastructure speaks to our current struggles with water management in an era of increasing scarcity and unpredictability. The Western United States, for example, faces water allocation challenges that would be entirely familiar to Egyptian administrators. How do you share limited water between agricultural, urban, and environmental needs? How do you manage long-term storage? How do you adapt when historical patterns no longer hold? The Egyptian experience with political fragmentation during climate stress should worry us. Modern societies aren't immune to this dynamic. When resources become scarce, when populations are stressed, political cohesion weakens. We see it in migration crises, in conflicts over resources, in the breakdown of international cooperation when each nation prioritizes its own survival. Those who remember the Cold War understand how quickly cooperation can collapse when fear and scarcity dominate. Egypt's intermediate periods, when unified kingdoms broke into competing regions, those weren't aberrations. They were what happened when central authority lost the resources and legitimacy to maintain cohesion. Modern nation-states aren't immune to similar dynamics, but there's also reason for hope in the Egyptian story. They did adapt. They did survive. They developed innovations born from necessity. They rebuilt after collapse. Humans are remarkably resilient and creative when survival demands it. The question is whether we can be proactive rather than reactive. Egypt often adapted after crisis hit. We have the advantage of knowing climate change is coming. We have scientific understanding that Egyptians lacked. We have technology they couldn't imagine. Can we use these advantages to prepare before catastrophe forces adaptation upon us? Egypt's religious response to climate crisis, the intensified ritual, the desperate appeals to divine favor. This should resonate with us too, not because we should repeat their theological explanations, but because we should recognize the human impulse to seek meaning and control in the face of terrifying change. Modern climate denial or minimization serves psychological functions not entirely different from ancient Egyptian religious framing. Both are ways of managing anxiety about threats that feel overwhelming and beyond individual control. Understanding this doesn't make denial okay, but it does help us address it more effectively. People need not just data, but meaning, not just warnings, but hope, not just problems, but agency. The Egyptian scribal tradition's preservation of knowledge across millennia speaks to our need to maintain institutional memory and expertise. When we defund scientific research, when we ignore historical precedent, when we dismiss expert knowledge in favor of political expediency, we're making ourselves more vulnerable. Egypt survived in part because they remembered, they learned, they maintained expertise across generations. Those of you who've lived through major technological and social changes, from the Depression through World War to the space age, from segregation to civil rights, from analog to digital, you understand that societies can transform dramatically. The question is whether transformation is managed or chaotic, whether it happens with foresight or as last-minute crisis response. Egypt teaches us that resilience is possible but not guaranteed, that geography and luck matter, but so do choices, that infrastructure and institutions take generations to build, but can be lost quickly if not maintained, that social cohesion is fragile and precious, that crisis can spur innovation but at terrible cost. Most importantly, perhaps, Egypt teaches us that we are not the first civilization to face existential environmental challenge, and we won't be the last. Our specific crisis is unique to our time, but the fundamental test: can humanity adapt to changing environment while maintaining what makes civilization worth having? That's ancient. We have advantages Egypt lacked. We also have disadvantages they didn't face. What we choose to do with our advantages, how we prepare for our challenges, whether we build resilience or assume problems, will solve themselves. These choices will determine whether future historians study our era as an example of successful adaptation or catastrophic failure. Before we close, we need to remember something important. Behind all these historical abstractions, climate data, political structures, infrastructure systems, were individual human beings, real people with names and families and hopes and fears. People who woke up one morning to find their world transformed by forces beyond their control or comprehension. Imagine being an Egyptian farmer. You're, let's say, 35 years old. You've spent your entire life farming a plot of land your father farmed before you. You know the rhythms of the Nile as intimately as you know your own breathing. You can read the river, predict the flood, time your planting perfectly. You're not rich, but you're competent. You feed your family. You fulfill your obligations to the temple and Pharaoh. You have a place in the order of things. Then one year, the impossible happens. The river freezes. Your crops die. Your children go hungry. The order you relied on has shattered, and nobody can explain why or when it will be restored. What do you do? Where do you turn? How do you maintain hope when the foundation of your world has proven unstable? Some people, in such circumstances, collapse. The psychological weight becomes too much. Depression, despair, giving up. Others get angry, directing rage at authorities who failed to prevent disaster, at the gods who allowed it, at neighbors who have more than you do. Still others simply endure, putting one foot in front of the other because that's all they know how to do, surviving one day at a time until either conditions improve or death provides release. We'll never know the names of most people who lived through Egypt's climate crises. Their stories weren't written down. History preserves pharaohs and high priests, not farmers and laborers. But those unnamed individuals were the ones who suffered most directly, who paid the highest price, whose lives were shortened or extinguished by forces they couldn't control. When we talk about Egypt surviving climate catastrophe, we need to remember that Egypt, the abstraction, the civilization, survived by sacrificing some of its people. The society persisted. Many individuals did not. That's the grim arithmetic of crisis. Some survive so that the larger whole can continue. Those of you who served in combat understand this terrible calculus. Missions require sacrifice. Some come home, others don't. Victory is measured at the strategic level, while loss is experienced at the individual level. Egypt's climate resilience worked the same way. The children who died of starvation during famine years didn't contribute to Egypt's long-term resilience. They were casualties of it. The farmers who lost their land and became landless laborers or slaves, they paid the price for other people's survival. The builders who froze to death working on infrastructure projects meant to enhance future resilience. They gave their lives without knowing whether those projects would succeed. We honor their memory not by pretending their suffering had meaning or purpose, but by acknowledging that they endured what we hope never to endure, that they faced challenges we can barely imagine, and that their lives mattered even though history forgot their names. When we study how Egypt adapted to climate change, we're studying the strategies that worked for the society as a whole. But we should never forget the human cost of that adaptation, the individuals who suffered and died, the families torn apart, the dreams destroyed, the lives cut short. Modern climate change will extract similar costs if we fail to prepare adequately. Real people will lose homes, livelihoods, loved ones. Communities will be displaced. Some regions will become uninhabitable. The statistics and projections that climate scientists present, sea level rise, temperature increases, agricultural disruption, these translate to human suffering at scales difficult to comprehend. Those who lived through war or witnessed its aftermath understand that behind every casualty statistic is a person who mattered to someone. Behind every refugee number is a family's story of loss and displacement. Behind every economic collapse figure is someone who went hungry, someone who lost everything they'd worked for, someone whose life was diminished or destroyed. Egypt's story teaches us that societies can survive climate catastrophe, but it should also remind us of the cost. The goal shouldn't be merely to ensure civilization persists in some form. The goal should be to minimize how many individual lives are ruined in the process. When ancient Egyptians made offerings at graves, when they preserved memories of the dead, they were doing what humans have always done, insisting that individual lives matter, that death diminishes us, that those who came before deserve to be remembered with respect and grief. We owe the same to them, those who froze when the Nile froze, who starved when the harvests failed, who suffered in ways we can only imagine. They deserve more than to be reduced to data points in our study of historical resilience. They were people, they mattered. And so we return to where we began, a river that shouldn't freeze, a climate that shouldn't change, a civilization that faced the impossible and somehow endured. The Nile flows today as it has for millennia. The climate that produced ancient Egypt's prosperity eventually stabilized after its periods of upheaval. The crises passed, life continued. Egypt, in various forms, persisted for 3,000 years. Longer than any modern nation has existed. Longer than Christianity or Islam have shaped human civilization. That persistence speaks to human resilience, yes, but it also speaks to the particular advantages Egypt enjoyed. Geography that provided a reliable foundation for recovery, even after catastrophic disruption. Other civilizations, facing similar climate stress without Egypt's geographic advantages, collapsed entirely and never recovered. What can we take from this ancient story as we face our own climate challenges? Several things, perhaps. First, respect for forces beyond human control. The Egyptians, for all their engineering prowess and administrative sophistication, couldn't make the Nile freeze or unfreeze, couldn't summon rain or command the sun. They could only respond, adapt, endure. We face the same fundamental limitation. We can influence our climate future through choices we make now, but we cannot control it absolutely. Nature, ultimately, operates according to its own patterns, and sometimes those patterns devastate human plans. Second, the value of preparation and resilience. Egypt survived because it invested in infrastructure, maintained reserves, preserved knowledge, built redundancy into its systems. These weren't luxuries, they were survival necessities. Modern societies that neglect such investments, that prioritize short-term consumption over long-term resilience, are making themselves more vulnerable. Egypt understood that stability requires constant work, that resilience must be built during good times to be available during bad times. Third, the importance of social cohesion and institutional capacity. Egypt's bureaucracy, its priestly hierarchies, its administrative structures, these provided coordination and continuity that made organized response to crisis possible. When these institutions fragmented, response capacity degraded. Modern parallels are obvious: functioning government, professional civil service, institutional expertise. These aren't bureaucratic luxuries, but essential infrastructure for managing large-scale challenges. Fourth, recognition of human cost. Civilizational survival required individual sacrifice. Some people paid terrible prices so that others could survive, so that the society as a whole could persist. We should neither romanticize this nor dismiss it. We should remember it and use that memory to motivate better preparation, more equitable distribution of burdens, greater effort to minimize how many people must suffer. Those of you who've lived through major historical events, wars, economic collapses, technological revolutions, social transformations, you understand that change is constant, that crises come, that societies either adapt or fail. Your generation has witnessed more change than any previous generation in human history. You've seen the world transform in ways your grandparents couldn't have imagined. The challenge we face now, climate change driven by our own industrial civilization, is different in cause from what ancient Egypt experienced, but not entirely different in effect. We face environmental transformation that threatens established patterns, that challenges infrastructure designed for one climate as conditions shift toward another, that strains social and political systems, that will require adaptation on a scale we've never attempted. We have advantages Egypt lacked: scientific understanding of what's happening and why, global communication and coordination capacity, technology that seems magical compared to what ancient peoples could achieve. But we also face challenges they didn't: far larger population, global interconnected systems where failure anywhere can cascade everywhere, environmental degradation beyond just climate change. The question is whether we'll use our advantages wisely, whether we'll invest in resilience before crisis forces it upon us, whether we'll maintain the social cohesion and institutional capacity needed for coordinated response, whether we'll remember that behind all the statistics and projections are individual human beings whose lives and well-being should matter to us. Egypt's frozen Nile, if it happened as the evidence suggests, was a catastrophe. People died, families starved, political systems collapsed, but Egypt survived. The civilization rebuilt, recovered, persisted. Millennia later, we can learn from their experience, both from what they did right and from the costs they paid. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, perhaps you'll think about water differently, about the systems we depend on and rarely notice until they fail, about the people who lived before us, who faced challenges we can barely imagine, who persevered so that we could exist. The Nile flows tonight as it has for millennia. Our climate is changing as theirs once did. The challenges differ in detail, but echo in fundamental ways across time. If tonight's journey stirred memories of harsh winters, of resource scarcity, of times when reliable systems proved fragile, I'd be honored if you shared them below. Your generation holds experiences and wisdom that younger folks desperately need to hear. The comment section is yours. Those who remember rationing, who survived the Depression, who witnessed how communities pulled together during crisis or fell apart under strain. Your perspectives matter. History isn't just what scholars write in books. It's what people like you remember, what you learned, what you can teach. And in the quiet of history, across thousands of years and countless lives, one truth echoes: We are all trying to survive in a world we don't fully control, doing our best with the knowledge and resources available to us, hoping our efforts prove sufficient for ourselves and for those who come after. The past whispers its lessons if we're willing to listen. The future demands our response, and we stand, as every generation has stood, in between inheritors of history, shapers of what comes next. Now rest well, and I'll see you in the next one.